Vítejte potleskem pana profesora a Andreje Zubova.
Dear friends, I am sorry to speak not Czech but English. You see, I'm a stupid person and maybe very old, but for me it was rather difficult to study Czech language and to speak on it fluently. Even English, even my English is not very good, but what to do? I have no other lingua franca between us. And as you know, I deliver lectures in English in Masaryk University. So, first of all, I want to congratulate you with your great date of freedom. I understand that for young people, it is something rather distant and not actual. And maybe some of you hear in your families from your grandfathers and grandmothers that life under the communist regime was not so bad. Maybe it was even good, but it's a mistake. Of course, almost all old people had positive reflections about their youth, since at that time they were young, brave, jeunes sportifs. And they think that life was fine. It was not fine. It was really unhuman totalitarian regime which gave no possibilities for free expression of a personality. I think that the main features of human being are two. It is freedom of action and the possibility to realize your will in your deeds and words. And another one is the freedom of creation, possibility to create what you like. It might be simple creation of farmer in his plot of land. It may be a creation of a writer in his books or artist in the theater. Nevertheless, each creation ought to be free. And if it is not free, if it is controlled, and it was terribly controlled during communist regime, in Czechoslovakia and also in the Soviet Union and other countries of communist bloc, it is unhuman form of life. It's not a destiny of man in this control over personality. It is the main thing. Not more prosperous or less prosperous in economic sense. Of course, communist states were not very prosperous since economic system was wrong. But it's not the main thing. The main thing is a destiny of a person. And when the Velvet Revolution occurred in November 1989, 35 years ago, it occurred not for prosperity, not even for a reunification with Europe and world, but it was made for destiny of man. That's why the leader of your peaceful revolution was Václav Havel, man of humanities, man of theater, man of intellectual discourse, because it was the main problem. And when you heard that life was not so bad at that time, you have to understand that it's a misinterpretation of historical reality. Life was bad. That's why people try to change it, maybe very naive, in 1968, during the Prague Spring, and then in 1989. It's necessary to say that if in Prague Spring, Czech and Slovak nations were alone and all other regimes all around them, from the Soviet Union up to East Germany and Hungary, were against it and used their arms to suppress Prague Spring. In 1989, situation was absolutely different. I'm sure that this series of revolutions in Europe, liberating anti-communist revolutions of 1989, were because of perestroika in the Soviet Union, because of Gorbachev. As President Bush told in spring 1989, I understood that Gorbachev himself is perestroika, and it's absolutely right definition. The process of liberation started in the Soviet Union. Democratization and free expression of public opinion, is гласность in Russian, yes, were the main features of this process from about 1986 maybe. And at that time in Czechoslovakia under Gustav Gusek, in Hungary, in GDR, Eastern Germany, in Poland even, situation was absolutely different. In Poland it was a military dictatorship, and in other states it was communist dictatorship. But the process started in the Soviet Union. They began to change, not minds. Minds were changed already. It began to change in spirit of people. People who were suppressed by the communist regimes, by secret police, they began to understand that it's possible to change their life. Like in the Soviet Union, it was changing at that time. When Gorbachev visited Czechoslovakia in 1987, in spring 1987, he was welcomed by great crowds of people, and these people cried, Gorbachev, stay here, be our leader. Not all people at that time knew that Gorbachev, in his personality, in his political attitude, was in some ways a child of Prague Spring of 1968. And not only of this moment. His best friend, through all his life, from his university days in the beginning of 50s, was Zdeněk Mlynář, one of the persons who was an activist, political activist during the Prague Spring. And he spoke with Mlynář a lot of themes of socialism, with human face. At that time, in 50s, in 60s, the majority of people in socialist countries, they believe in some human socialism. The ideological press was so hard that it changed minds of people, and they really believed that socialism, Lenin's socialism, was something good. Gorbachev supposed so, and Mlynar up till the end of his life. As you remember, after Velvet Revolution, he returned from Austria and tried, because he also signed the Charter of 77, and he was forced to emigrate, but he returned to Prague, to Czechoslovakia, and took part in the elections, parliamentary elections, as a socialist, but lost them. So at that time it was an idea of human socialism. Of course, in practice it's a mistake. If we speak about socialism as Marxism, it's impossible to have a human Marxism. It's impossible. It's a mystification. Because just in 1848, when Marx and Engels wrote their Communist Manifesto, they wrote about totalitarian state. Practically, it was totalitarian state, even without family. Even family was forbidden. Not to speak about commercial activity and so on. But at that time, in the 50s and 60s, these dreams were positive and very, very sympathetic. I suppose that if, for example, if we imagine that communist states, the Soviet Union, didn't crash Prague Spring in 1968, step by step, Dubček government changed Czechoslovakia not to socialist state with human face, but to normal democratic liberal state with more social orientated state or less social orientated states. It's depend on the people, but it will be developed in democratic way. As you know, dear friends, this autumn of 1989, which the 35th anniversary we celebrate today, this autumn was named by historians at that time as Autumn of Nations. You remember very well that just 1848, a series of revolutions all around Europe, in France, in Germany, in Austrian Empire at that time, but in Hungary, in Austria, even in Romania. This series of revolutions was named a Spring of Nations, because the main part of these revolutions took place in the spring of 1848. And now, 35 years ago, it was Autumn of Nations. Because all nations of Eastern Europe, and even in the Soviet Union, they wake up. They decided that it's possible to start to build democratic, Western-like political systems. And you here in Czechoslovakia, you were successful in this way, I'm sure. My glance is a little bit out of Eastern Europe. My glance is from Russia. And I see that you, especially in Czech Republic, you were very, very accurate and effective in deconstructing totalitarian system and constructing a new one, non-communist system. We, in political language, named it decommunization, systematic system decommunization. In Czech Republic, this system decommunization was made very effectively. Because of government, but because of people. Czechoslovakia was a democratic state before 1948. And your parents and your grandparents had the reflection of democracy, had the reflection of free market, had a reflection of private property and freedom of speech and freedom of political expression. That's why you were successful in constructing a new reality. I suppose that other countries of Central Europe, Poland, Hungary, Slovenia, and Croatia, a little bit in some way, were all successful. Less successful were Balkan states, Romania, Bulgaria, and of course these states of Western Balkans, Albania, North Macedonia, and so on. But all your countries did this systematic decommunization. Some of them just from 1989, some as Baltic states a little bit later, but from 1991, and some as Albania only in 2016, 2015, but they started the same, even Serbia, they started this process. Nothing like this was done in the former Soviet Union. Only in Baltic states this process of decommunization was started and I think effectively realized. Of course, there were some mistakes, some wrong steps, it's understandable. It's necessary to understand, dear friends, that no country before this 1989, or maybe before perestroika, no country in the world had an experience to go from totalitarian, not only political, but economical system. Even a Nazi regime in Germany and fascist regime in Italy were not totalitarian in economics. Economics were maybe not totally free. It was a fascist system of corporations, but it was normal competitive economics. And in all communist states, there were no competitive economics at all, and no private property at all. And it was necessary to return to private property and competitive free economics. And nobody knew how to do it. All countries do it maybe step by step. There were some recommendations of European Union, but even in European Union, professors understood some general principles, but not tactics. That's why there were mistakes. And beside of mistakes, there were also problems with difficulties, natural difficulties, because two things were problematic. How to change economics to free market from state economics. How to do it. And another, how to change brains from this habit to live in distributing economic system where it's not necessary to work hard to have all necessary to live. How to change this very you see, it's a system which people, majority of people, prefer to competitive system, because there were some guarantees of low level of life, and it was necessary to change it to real competition. How to do it? In Eastern Europe, nations were very much more effective in this field than in the Soviet Union, and it's understandable why. Before a revolution, before 1917, in Russia also was a competitive economics, normal market, normal capitalist market, no distributive economics at all, no totalitarian administration system in economics. But it was changed to totalitarian economics with great force in 30s, in 1930s. And people forgot, absolutely forgot, about this natural form of life, and were used to live in absolutely unnatural economic system. The same, it's possible to say about revolution, even in Russia, with its authoritarian in some way state. There were parliament, state Duma, there were laws, there were independent courts, independent legal system, different political parties. And people step by step used to live in democratic state. It's necessary, again, it's necessary to remember that in no one continental state, parliamentary democracy was actual before this revolution, the Spring of Nations, before except France, before 1848. So Russia was not so obsolete in comparison with other European countries. But everything was absolutely destroyed during communist regime, and from Russia, from the Soviet Union, in Soviet Union it was much more difficult to go away from this communist totalitarian state than in Czechoslovakia, for example. Why? Because in Czechoslovakia you preserved some continuation of reflection. Almost all your grandfathers and grandmothers, they remembered the life before Hitler and Stalin. It was, and they made this life of their youth, their young age, as some dream. It was wonderful during the period of Masaryk and so on. It was so good life. In Baltic states it was the same. But in the Soviet Union, nobody remembered of that life before revolution, because it was 70 years, the age of three generations. Nobody remembered this life before revolution. And massacre was much more severe in the Soviet Union than in East European countries. Much more people were killed and sent to concentration camps. So in the Soviet Union, almost nobody, and Gorbachev among them, almost nobody think about this systematic decommunization, about restoration, restitution of property, some recollection of pre-communist times, and change of historical paradigm from communist to pre-communist regime. Almost nobody, even Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who want to change this paradigm in history, but not in legal sense. When I spoke with him, and we were friends with him, but he, of course, he was from the 1917, and I'm from 1952. I was, my age is the age of his children. So he can't understand about restitution of property, for example. And here in Czech Republic, restitution of property was the main key to the doors of systematic decommunization. The main key, because people, citizens of Czech Republic, found themselves not only with freedom. Freedom is some abstract thing. And see, of course, intellectuals like Václav Havel, they like freedom as a main value. But for many, for majority of people, it ought to be something more material. And of course, restitution of property is this more material thing. All people received something. Somebody more, large amounts of property, somebody not so much, and even small amounts, but almost everybody received something. And this was the base of stability. Of course, the first decade of post-communist life was difficult, 90s. But the main base of stability was made. And the second item, of course, is restoration. Here in Czech Republic, just as in other states of Eastern Europe, members of communist repressive system, secret police, and even communist political activists were in some way forbidden to take part in political process. And it's also a positive thing. If such a rule, such a principle was accepted in the Soviet Union, no Yeltsin, no Putin would be able to be a ruler of the state. But in the Soviet Union, nobody think about this. No political activists, no population. We suppose that it was possible to go into democracy, to go into Western style life, to go into free competitive market economics without restitution, without restoration, without change of paradigm, historical paradigm, without any processes against people who made cruel things during the communist regime. And many of these people were not only still alive, but they were active, very active in the end of 80s. But nobody think about it. And we see the result. The result is not in some genetic differences between Russians and Czechs. There are no political genetics. It's necessary to understand once and forever. There are no racist principles that they're more superior and inclined to democracy nations and less developed and genetically not prepared for democracy nations. No, everything was in political system. But the problem was not so easy because if, for example, I or somebody else would express these ideas of systematic decommunization in 1989, nobody in Russia understood me. Nobody. From Gorbachev to simple people, workers and peasants. If I spoke about restitution of property, nobody accepted this idea. Even people, successors of these poor peasants who lived in kolkhozes after confiscation of their land, even these people would not accept the idea of restitution of property. These ideas were absolutely dismantled in the Soviet Union. Only now people began to understand these things. So it was very difficult to do what was necessary to do in former Soviet Union. And you may see that all republics of former Soviet Union, except Baltic states, and maybe also Moldavia, because these four small republics were incorporated in the Soviet Union in 1940, as you remember. And all other were part of the Soviet Union during the period of terrible repressions of 20s and 30s. And you see that all these were not able to build stable, democratic, and competitive market economic societies. Even Ukraine. Before this war, Ukraine was an oligarchical system. It was not democracy at all. It was the system where some oligarchs struggled for power. In Russia, it was autocracy. In Belarus, it was autocracy. In Ukraine, in Georgia, in Armenia, maybe in Kyrgyzstan, there were these oligarchical but not democratic states. And in Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, there were totalitarian, tyrannic states. Turkmenia for sure, and Tajikistan. So in the Soviet Union, it was impossible to build the democracy because of terrible repressions and long period of totalitarian communist state. But what to do? I started to speak about this necessity to make a systematic decommunization in Russia in the end of 1993. I very well remember the first my projects. We tried to organize political party at that time in State Duma and so on. So during the early Yeltsin time. And I continue to do it up till now. Now I have much more supporters. But what to do? What to do now? We see the problem. In Russia and in many other parts of the former Soviet Union, simple people, non-democratic world, just because of this non-democratic world, terrible war against Ukraine started. But not only this war. You know that there was a terrible war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Before it was a terrible conflict in Moldavia and Prednistrovia. It was conflicts in Central Asia between Kyrgyzia and Tajikistan, Kyrgyzia and Uzbekistan. In Tajikistan, it was a terrible civil war. So these military and bloody conflicts turned to be a reality. And how to change it now? Of course, first step is absolutely clear. This war ought to be finished in Ukraine, I mean, and Russia ought to return from all occupied territories, and ought to help Ukraine to restore its life after this terrible devastation of the war. It's clear. And for me, there is no question about Donbass, about Crimea. All these parts of Ukraine ought to be returned to Ukraine, and the stability, integrity of borders, which were in 1991, ought to be supported. And it is clear. But what to do after this? After this. The main problem is what to do after this. And this is a problem which ought to be solved not only even in Russia, but also in Ukraine, also in Kazakhstan, in Armenia, in Georgia. You see that Georgia now very quickly developed to anti-democratic regime. I think, my dear friends, that we ought now to follow the principles which you in Czechoslovakia, in Czech Republic, did after this Autumn of Nations, after this Velvet Revolution. You are an example for us how to construct our states, maybe Russian state, after the end of this terrible war. The same principles, and of course democracy. I understand that now, after the last elections, after the last parliamentary elections in Czech Republic, maybe some of you say that, oh, it is not a democracy, you see, not the people we like won the elections. But it's a mistake. It's a mistake. Not always we won elections. Very often our opponents, and not very sympathetic, not the people of great sympathy for us, won the elections. We ought to accept the will of majority of population. It's also an experience, It's one of the elements of democratic experience. And to finish I spoke a lot of time. But to finish it, I want to say that we have also another example. We have Eastern Europe, which successfully built democratic states with a lot of problems, even here in Czech Republic, but also, of course, there are a lot of problems in Bulgaria, in Serbia, in GDR with this alternative for Germany. But we have also a negative example. It is China. In China, the process of democratization, the process of perestroika, started even before it took place in the Soviet Union. It started, I suppose, in 1978, 2 years after the death of Mao Zedong. And it was a possibility at that time to build a democratic Chinese nation and to unify country in free elections with Taiwan. Many people wanted to vote for Kuomintang in continental China at that time. And the main moment, the general moment of this peaceful Chinese revolution, not many people know about it, was the spring of the same year, 1989, May 1989. And in the beginning of June, in Tiananmen Square and all around China, the student and workers' protests and movements very close to this Prague Spring of 1968 and Russian perestroika, Soviet perestroika of the end of 80s took place. But all this was crashed by tanks when Deng Xiaoping decided not to follow a democratic way. He dismissed his prime minister. He dismissed his, before it, head of the party, and decided to construct free market without democracy. Free market for communist leaders. Free market for communist elite, not for all Chinese. He was successful. China turned to be a great state after this, but with no freedom at all. With no possibility to speak freely, to create freely. The only freedom was to emigrate freely, but not for all people, even this. And I think that this experiment will not be successful. Now it seems to be rather successful, but it will not be successful. And step by step, China returned to the real tyranny with Xi Jinping. So you see 3 examples. Eastern Europe, successful democratic constructing system. Former Soviet Union, except Baltic states and maybe Moldavia, with this competition between elements of democracy and elements of former communist KGB autocracy. Very terrible conflict. Now in the form of and China and of course Vietnam, also North Korea, as a states which and Cuba, as a states which were successful to to control the political regime in China and Vietnam with an elements of market economy. We'll see what it will be in future. So you see that this political picture is now in the process of drawing. And you here is an example for many of us how to do things. So this day of the 35th anniversary of 35th anniversary of Velvet Revolution is a great day and holiday in the ancient sense of this word, holiday not only for you, and then maybe even not for you in such a level as for us, and as for many peoples in Eastern communist states which continue to dream for democratic solution of their problems. Thank you.